The sound of solid oak splitting in half is something a structural engineer never forgets. I have heard bridges groan under impossible loads. I have heard retaining walls surrender to the earth behind them. But nothing in 40 years of building things prepared me for the sound of that chair giving way beneath my daughter-in-law at my own anniversary dinner, in front of 60 people who had gathered to celebrate the 40 years I spent loving the woman she had spent 3 years trying to destroy. But you need to understand what happened 4 hours earlier. You need to understand why I was sitting calmly at the head of that table, cutting my prime rib, while the woman who had tried to put my wife in a nursing home was learning a very expensive lesson about load-bearing capacity. I arrived at Harrington's at 4:30 in the afternoon. The dinner was not until 7. I have been early to every project site for 40 years. That habit does not leave you when you retire. You check the foundation before you invite people to stand on it. The private dining room was beautiful. My daughter-in-law Vanessa had chosen it, of course, and charged it to the card I had given my son Michael for exactly this purpose. Crystal chandeliers, white linen, a room that smelled of old money and fresh flowers. The staff was setting the long mahogany table, arranging the name cards, lighting the tall ivory candles. The head florist nodded at me respectfully as I walked in. I had tipped him $200 the week before to make sure Eleanor's favorite flowers, pale yellow roses, were placed at her seat. I started walking the room the way I always walk a job site, slowly, methodically. I checked the table spacing. I checked the chair alignment. I was not looking for anything in particular. I was simply looking, the way a man who has spent his career preventing catastrophe looks at any structure before trusting people's safety to it. That is when I saw it. The chair at Eleanor's place, the one marked with the small card that read Wife of Honor in the same calligraphy Vanessa had selected, was slightly different from the others. To anyone else at a glance, it was identical. Same dark wood, same cushioned seat, same curved back. But I am not anyone else. I crouched down. The front 2 legs of the chair had been worked on. I could see it clearly, under the natural light coming through the tall windows. Fine, deliberate saw cuts, angled inward about 1/3 of the way through each leg. Not enough to make the chair look damaged. Not enough for anyone to notice by sitting down gently, but enough that under sustained weight, under the pressure of a person shifting, standing, and pressing down to rise, the wood would fracture along that cut line. The chair would not just wobble, it would collapse sideways, throwing the person sitting in it directly onto the floor. Eleanor had a stroke 14 months ago. It was mild, the doctor said. She recovered most of her mobility, but her left side is still weaker than the right, and her balance is not what it was. A fall from a collapsing chair, a hard, sideways crash onto a marble floor, could break her hip, her wrist, her shoulder. At 64 years old, with her current bone density, it could do far worse than that. I touched the cut with my fingernail. The wood was clean. The saw work was recent. It had been done within the last 24 hours, after the chairs were arranged. I stayed crouched down for a long moment. I breathed through my nose. In my working life, I once discovered that a subcontractor had falsified the concrete test results on a hospital foundation. I felt then exactly what I felt now. Not panic, not even rage, not immediately. What I felt first was a cold, clarifying grief. The kind that comes when you realize the structural failure was not an accident, it was a choice. I thought about who had been at this venue in the last day. Vanessa had come yesterday afternoon to approve the floral arrangements and review the seating chart. She had been alone. Michael was at work, or so he said. I stood up slowly. I looked at the chair next to Eleanor's designated seat. That one was assigned to Vanessa. I checked its legs. Solid. Perfect. Untouched. I looked around the empty dining room. The florist was arranging centerpieces at the far end. A young busboy was polishing glasses near the service door, his back to me. I had perhaps 90 seconds. A structural engineer does not panic in a crisis. He assesses the load, identifies the failure point, and redirects the force. He does not destroy the building. He redirects the damage to where it can be contained. I reached out and picked up the name card that read Wife of Honor. My hand was completely steady. I placed it in front of the solid chair, the untouched one. Then I picked up Vanessa's card, daughter-in-law. I set it precisely in front of the compromised chair. I stepped back. I looked at the table. Everything appeared identical. Then I walked to the bar, ordered a club soda, and waited for my wife. Eleanor arrived at 5:15 on the arm of her sister Ruth, who had driven down from Connecticut for the occasion. I watched my wife come through the door of Harrington's, and I had to pause. 14 months of recovery, of physical therapy, of relearning how to button a shirt with a hand that did not always cooperate, and she still walked into a room the way she always had, with her chin up, with that particular smile that makes every space she enters warmer than it was before. She was wearing the navy dress she had bought for the occasion, and the pearl earrings I gave her on our 20th anniversary. She looked like everything I had spent 40 years trying to be worthy of. I walked over and took her hand. "You look beautiful," I said. She laughed softly. "You are biased." "Completely," I agreed. She squeezed my arm. Her left hand was the weaker one, but the grip was there. She was stronger than she looked, and she had always been stronger than people gave her credit for. That was partly why Vanessa hated her. Strong women threaten people who depend on appearing strong while actually being hollow. The guests began arriving at 6:30. Friends from our neighborhood, colleagues from my years at the engineering firm, Eleanor's book club, a few old friends from the hospital where she had worked as a pediatric nurse for 30 years before the stroke changed those plans. 60 people who genuinely loved us. I watched them come in, hug Eleanor, laugh with her, and I thought about what Vanessa had tried to arrange for this evening. She had wanted 60 witnesses to see Eleanor fall. My son Michael arrived with Vanessa at 6:45. They made an entrance, naturally. Vanessa was wearing a red dress that cost more than some people's monthly rent. She had her hair done. She was radiant in the way a person is radiant when they believe the evening is already won. She hugged me with the warmth of a person performing warmth for an audience. "Dad," she said, kissing my cheek, "this room is absolutely perfect. Doesn't it look incredible, Michael?" Michael smiled the way he always smiles when Vanessa is present. Like a man watching a play he is not sure he understands, hoping his expression is appropriate. My son is not a bad person. He was, in the beginning, a good man. But good men who are not careful can be slowly convinced that the person they love has their best interests at heart, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Michael had been convinced, over 3 years, that his mother was a burden, that she was difficult, that her stroke had made her unstable, unpredictable, an obstacle to the life Vanessa had planned for them. I had watched it happen. I had said nothing for too long. Vanessa turned to Eleanor and opened her arms. Eleanor hugged her with genuine warmth, because that is who Eleanor is. She still believed, even now, that Vanessa was simply difficult to know. She still believed that love was a long enough game that patience would eventually win. Vanessa pulled back from the hug and tilted her head with the expression of exaggerated concern she had perfected. "Eleanor," she said, keeping her voice low but not low enough. "How are you feeling? You look a little tired around the eyes. Are you sure you are up for a long evening? Because Michael and I completely understand if you want to cut out early. We can handle the toasts." Eleanor blinked. "I feel wonderful, Vanessa. It is my anniversary." Vanessa sighed, the way a nurse sighs at a patient who insists they are fine. "Of course you do. Just, if the noise gets to be too much, or if you start feeling foggy, just signal Michael, and we will get you home. We don't want a repeat of Christmas." She meant the moment at Christmas dinner when Eleanor's left hand had trembled and she had spilled a glass of water. Vanessa had been retelling that story for a year, to everyone who would listen, as evidence of Eleanor's decline. I watched Eleanor's face change. The warmth dimmed. She straightened slightly and looked down at her purse for a moment. I put my hand on the small of Eleanor's back. "She is going to outlast every person in this room," I said, my voice easy and pleasant. "Come on, love. Let me show you where you are sitting." I guided Eleanor to her chair, the solid one, the safe one, with her name card in front of it. I helped her sit and adjusted the chair slightly for her comfort. She smiled up at me. "Thank you, Arthur," she said. I patted her hand and went to greet the other guests. I moved through the room, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. My mind was entirely calm. I had built bridges across rivers that did not want to be crossed. I had managed construction sites through floods and labor strikes and the particular human chaos of bureaucracy. I was not going to be undone by a woman with a handsaw and an inheritance strategy. I flagged down the restaurant manager, a composed man named Gerald who had run Harrington's for 12 years. I had spoken with Gerald 3 days earlier when I first started watching Vanessa's behavior. I had tipped him generously and asked a specific favor. He nodded at me from across the room. Everything was in place. I went to my seat. The first course arrived at 7:15, shrimp bisque, followed by a Caesar salad. The conversation around the table was warm and easy. I watched Eleanor come alive the way she always does when she is surrounded by people who love her. She was laughing at something Ruth was saying, gesturing with her right hand, leaning forward to hear a story from our old neighbor Frank. Vanessa was watching her from the other end of the table, not watching with pleasure, watching with the focused patience of a person waiting for their cue. I reached under the table and took out my phone. I opened my messages to my attorney Douglas, who had been on retainer for 26 years, and who understood, at this point, that when I sent him a message at dinner, it was not a social communication. I typed, "Proceed with the amendment we discussed tonight." Douglas replied within 2 minutes. "Done. Signed and filed electronically. New documents on your desk Monday." I put the phone back in my pocket and picked up my wine glass. 3 months ago, Vanessa had made a mistake. She made it on a Tuesday afternoon when she thought I was in my workshop and she was on a phone call in the kitchen. I was not in my workshop. I was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen, having come in through the side door to get a glass of water, and I heard her voice. She was talking to someone, a friend or her mother. I was never sure. She was explaining, in the patient, detailed way of someone who has thought about a plan many times, that Eleanor was getting worse, that the stroke had left her more impaired than anyone realized, and that it was only a matter of time before she would need full-time care. She explained that the best facilities ran $12,000 a month. She explained that the family home, the house Eleanor and I had built and paid off and lived in for 31 years, could cover those costs. She explained that if Arthur was handled carefully, if the right moment presented itself, the situation could be resolved in a way that benefited everyone. Handled carefully. Resolved. I am 67 years old, and I have spent my life calculating stress tolerance. I know exactly how much weight a structure can bear before it fails. Standing in that hallway, I understood that the structure of my family had been quietly undermined for a long time, and I had been too trusting to see the saw marks until I felt the wobble. I walked back out through the side door and stood in my driveway for 10 minutes. Then I went inside, made my glass of water, and told Eleanor I loved her. And that evening, I called Douglas. The main course arrived at the anniversary dinner. Prime rib, roasted vegetables, the kind of meal that costs too much and tastes worth it. The room was warm. The candles had been burning long enough to soften the edges of the light. People were finishing their second glasses of wine. Vanessa had been managing the table the way she always managed rooms, with just enough social competence to be admired and just enough calculated cruelty to be obeyed. She had interrupted Eleanor twice during the salad course, once to correct a story Eleanor was telling about Michael's childhood, and once to explain to the woman sitting beside Eleanor that Eleanor's memory was still a little Swiss cheese in places since the stroke. But we are managing. Eleanor had gone quiet after that. I had watched her put her fork down. I had watched her retreat into herself the way she had been doing more and more over the past 3 years. That slow, careful erasure of her own presence to avoid being the subject of Vanessa's commentary. I put my knife down. I reached over and filled Eleanor's wine glass. I said to the man on my left, loudly enough to carry down the table, "You know, Eleanor diagnosed a case of bacterial meningitis at 3 in the morning last year, before most attending physicians in that ER had figured it out. Old habit from nursing, sharp as ever." Eleanor looked at me. I raised my glass toward her. The man on my left said, "Is that right? You were an ER nurse?" And just like that, Eleanor was back. She sat up. She started talking. The color came back into her face. Vanessa's expression, at the other end of the table, was the expression of someone whose remote control has stopped working. She shifted in her chair. The toasts began at 8:30. Ruth gave the first one. It was funny and warm and made Eleanor cry in the good way. Our old friend Philip gave the second. My nephew gave the third. Each time someone stood for a toast, Vanessa stood as well, glass raised, performing the devoted daughter-in-law for the assembled guests. Each time she sat back down, she sat with the unself-conscious weight of a person who has no reason to think carefully about chairs. I watched. I did not rush. I have waited years for environmental permits. I have waited months for a foundation to cure properly before trusting weight to it. I could wait another 40 minutes for the right moment to arrive on its own. I had asked Gerald to hold the dessert course until he received my signal. I had also asked him to have the room's audio system patched to his phone, in case I needed to adjust the volume on something. Gerald was a professional. He understood that the man who had privately rented this room for the evening and paid the full buyout rate had certain reasonable preferences about how the event was managed. Michael stood for his toast at 8:50. He was nervous. He always was when he had to speak in public, which Vanessa considered a character flaw and I considered a human trait. He cleared his throat. He talked about what it meant to grow up in a house where his parents were visibly in love. He talked about the things he had learned watching us. His voice was unsteady in the middle, and his hands were shaking slightly. I watched Vanessa watching him. She had a small, tight smile. She was monitoring his performance the way a producer monitors a live broadcast, ready to intervene if the talent goes off script. He finished. People applauded. He sat down, and Vanessa immediately touched his arm and said something quietly into his ear. Whatever she said made the remaining color in his face disappear. Then she stood. She picked up her glass. She smoothed the front of her red dress. She had prepared a toast, clearly, because she spoke with the polished ease of someone who has rehearsed. She talked about family. She talked about legacy. She talked about the privilege of marrying into a family with such history, such love, such values. She talked about how much she admired Eleanor's strength and resilience in the face of her health challenges. She called Eleanor an inspiration. She said that watching Eleanor navigate the past year had given her a profound appreciation for how precious health was and how important it was, for everyone's sake, to surround aging loved ones with proper care and support. The people at the table who did not know Vanessa heard a loving tribute. I heard a girl marking her territory over a woman she had already decided to institutionalize. Vanessa raised her glass. To Arthur and Eleanor, she said, 40 years, and to many more, however they may look. However they may look. I raised my glass. I looked at her over the rim. She was smiling at the room. Then she sat down. I watched the back of the chair. Nothing happened. She shifted her weight. She recrossed her legs. She leaned sideways to say something to Michael. She had been sitting in that chair for an hour and 40 minutes. The load was distributed, the weakened legs stressed but holding. The cut I had examined was deep enough to fail, but wood is patient. Wood waits for the right kind of force. She was about to give it exactly that. At 9:15, I gave Gerald the signal. The lights in the room shifted. A warm, golden wash that the staff activated for the photo portion of the evening. Gerald stepped forward and gently announced that before dessert, the photographers would like to capture the table, and he invited everyone to remain seated for a group photograph, followed by a few posed shots with the guests of honor. Then Gerald said, "And if the family members at the head of the table could please stand together for a portrait, that would be wonderful." He looked at Vanessa and Michael. Vanessa loved photographs the way a fire loves oxygen. She was on her feet in an instant. She did not ease up gently. She did not ease up at all. She planted both hands on the armrests of the chair, pushed down hard, and drove herself upward with the cheerful, forceful energy of a person accustomed to being the center of every frame. The sound was not quiet. It was not the gentle creak of settling wood. It was a sharp, explosive crack. The sound of structural failure along a pre-cut fault line, the sound of wood choosing the weakest path when a load exceeds its tolerance. The front left leg snapped first, then the right, and the chair dropped forward and sideways. Vanessa screamed. She went down hard, her left knee hitting the marble floor, her glass of wine releasing itself into a wide red arc across her dress, across the white linen, across the sleeve of Michael's tuxedo. The chair clattered beside her, its two front legs broken clean at the same angle, the cut lines exposed and obvious in the chandelier light. The room erupted. Not with laughter, not immediately, but with the collective gasp of 60 people who have just witnessed a sudden fall. People pushed back their chairs. Michael reached for her. Two guests nearest her stood up. Vanessa was on the floor in her $600 red dress with wine soaking into the bodice, and both front legs of a chair snapped off beside her. She was not badly hurt. She had gone down on her knee, and her palm and wounded, mostly, the thing she guarded most carefully. Her composure, her image, her position as the most polished person in every room she entered. She looked up. Her hair had come loose. Her mascara was not designed for this. She looked at the chair. She looked at the broken legs. She looked at the clean, deliberate angles of the cuts. Then she looked at me. I was sitting calmly. My hands were folded on the table. I had not moved. Michael was helping her up. He was saying something soothing and apologetic. Default setting. "Babe, are you okay? I'm so sorry. The chair must have been defective." "It is not defective," Vanessa said. Her voice had changed. The polish was gone. What was underneath was harder and sharper and much less attractive. She was looking at the chair legs. She was looking at the cuts. She had a degree in interior design. She knew what a saw line looked like. She stood up. She gripped Michael's arm. Her knee was red. Her dress was ruined. She looked at the chair beside her. Then she looked at the name card in front of the seat where she had been sitting. Daughter-in-law. She looked at the name card in front of Eleanor's chair. She looked at Eleanor, sitting safely in an undamaged seat, looking at her with genuine confused concern. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor said. "Vanessa, what happened? Sit down." Vanessa did not sit down. "You," she said. The word came out low. "You moved the cards." Eleanor shook her head. "What are you talking about?" "The chairs," Vanessa said. Her voice was climbing. "Someone tampered with that chair and moved the cards. Someone switched them." The room was very quiet. 60 people were watching. I unfolded my hands. I set them flat on the table. "Why would switching the cards matter?" I said. "Unless one of the chairs was specifically prepared for a particular person." Vanessa went still. She understood what I had said. She understood that I had just said it in front of 60 witnesses. "I don't know what you're implying," she said. "I'm not implying anything," I said pleasantly. "I'm asking a structural question. If both chairs were identical and undamaged, the swap would be irrelevant. The only way the swap matters is if someone knew that a specific chair would fail under a specific person's weight, and the only way someone would know that is if they had arranged it." The room had developed the particular silence of a space where everyone has stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Michael looked at his wife. He looked at the broken chair. He looked at the cut lines in the legs. I watched my son's face cycle through several expressions that he had probably been suppressing for 3 years. "Vanessa," he said. It came out flat and careful, the way a man says a name when he is not sure what he is about to understand. "Michael, she set this up," Vanessa said, pointing at Eleanor. "She switched the chairs to make me look." "Eleanor cannot have done that," I said. "Eleanor arrived with Ruth and went directly to the room where the guests were gathering. She did not enter this dining room until she was escorted to her seat by me. I arrived 4 hours early. I have been here the entire time." I looked at Gerald. "Isn't that right?" Gerald, who had been standing near the service entrance, said, "Mr. Calloway arrived at 4:30. I can confirm that. The venue logs all entry and exits on keycard for liability purposes," I said. "I confirmed that with Gerald last week. Visitors to the private dining room are recorded." I looked at Vanessa. "You were here yesterday at 2:15. That is on the log." The color left Vanessa's face. Michael was no longer looking at his mother. He was looking at his wife. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been told is one thing and has finally seen is another. "The chair legs were cut," he said. It was not a question. With a small handsaw, I said, "Recent work, clean lines. The cuts are at a specific angle that would distribute the load initially and fail under dynamic stress, meaning the chair would hold through sitting but fracture upon standing. It is actually competent work from a technical standpoint. Whoever did it understood basic load mechanics." I paused. "Your mother has osteoporosis," I said, looking at Michael. "She has balance deficits on her left side. A fall from a collapsing chair onto marble flooring tonight could have fractured her hip, her shoulder, her wrist. At minimum, we both heard the doctor explain what a significant fall could mean for her recovery." Michael sat down, not because he chose to. His legs decided for him. Vanessa took a step toward me. "This is insane," she said. "You are accusing me of—" "I am not accusing you of anything," I said. "I am describing what I found when I inspected the chairs this afternoon. What I found and what I photographed." I reached into my jacket pocket and placed my phone on the table, screen up, displaying the close-up photograph I had taken of the cut chair legs at 4:45 this afternoon, with the timestamp visible in the frame. The table was silent. I picked up my phone. I opened my text messages and found the thread with Douglas. I read aloud. Not because Douglas needed to hear it, but because the room needed to. At 8:12 this evening, I sent a message to my attorney confirming the execution of a new estate document. This supersedes any previous arrangement. I put the phone face down on the table. I will spare everyone the details, but the short version is that the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, and the property holdings that Michael was listed as the primary beneficiary of in my previous will have been redirected. Michael will receive a modest inheritance with specific conditions attached. The remainder will be divided between the Children's Hospital, where Eleanor worked for 30 years, and an engineering scholarship fund. The number attached to those accounts was not a secret in our family. Vanessa had made sure of that. She had cataloged our assets with the focused attention of someone who considered herself their eventual owner. "You can't do that," Vanessa said. Her voice had gone from sharp to thin. "You can't just change everything tonight. You had plans. Michael was my son before he was your husband," I said, "and nothing that happened tonight has changed that. What I am changing is the assumption that the people who inherit what I have spent my life building are the same people who thought my wife's anniversary dinner was a reasonable time to arrange for her to be put on the floor." Vanessa turned to Michael. The mask was entirely off now. What I saw in her face was not love. It was the particular rage of a person whose investment has just been devalued. "Do something," she said to him. "Say something. This is your money, Michael. Your inheritance. He can't take it and give it to a hospital. Say something to him." Michael looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his mother. Eleanor was sitting perfectly still, her hands in her lap, her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears. "Mom," Michael said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. Eleanor put her hand over her mouth. "I'm sorry," he said. "I am so sorry. I didn't know about the chair. I swear to God, I did not know." He was telling the truth. I believed him then, and I believe him now. Michael is many things, but he is not capable of that specific cruelty. Vanessa had understood that about him, and had operated accordingly. She had kept him just far enough from the plan to maintain his ignorance and his usability. "I know," Eleanor said softly. She reached across the table. He took her hand. Vanessa looked at the two of them and understood, in that moment, that she had miscalculated the structural integrity of the relationship she had spent 3 years trying to undermine. She picked up her purse. She looked at me. "This isn't over," she said. "You are right about that," I said. "Gerald has already been in contact with the restaurant's insurance representative about the chair damage, and that log I mentioned, the entry and exit record, has been forwarded to our attorney. What happens next depends entirely on choices that have not been made yet." I looked at her steadily. "I would make those choices carefully." She walked out of the private dining room without looking back. Her heels on the marble sounded like a clock running out. The room held its collective breath for a moment. Then Ruth, Eleanor's sister, cleared her throat. "Well," Ruth said, in the dry tone that had always been her particular gift, "I have been to worse anniversary dinners." Soft laughter moved around the table, the kind that comes from relief rather than cruelty. The guests were good people. They understood that what had just happened was not entertainment, and they were not going to treat it as such. Within a few minutes, the careful murmur of private conversation resumed, gentle and protective, wrapping itself around Eleanor the way a good crowd wraps around someone who needs the cover. Gerald appeared at my elbow. "Shall I bring the dessert, Mr. Calloway?" "Yes," I said. "And another bottle of the Bordeaux, please. The good one." I reached over and refilled Eleanor's wine glass. She was still holding Michael's hand across the table. She was looking at him with the complicated expression of a mother who is grieving and forgiving at the same time, which is something only mothers can do simultaneously. "You need to eat something," I told her. "The chocolate cake is very good here. I had Gerald test it last week." She laughed. It was a small sound, but it was real. After dessert, after the photographs, after the last guests had said their goodbyes, with the slightly heightened warmth of people who have witnessed something that reminded them what actually matters, I helped Eleanor with her coat in the lobby of Harrington's. Michael had gone to find their car, or rather to find a cab, since Vanessa had left with the car. "Arthur," Eleanor said. How long did you know?" I buttoned the top button of her coat, the way I have been doing for 40 years because her hands get cold. "I heard a phone call," I said. 3 months ago." She was quiet for a moment. "And the chair? I found it this afternoon." She looked up at me. You could have told me. I could have, I agreed. But you would have spent the entire evening watching for it. And I didn't want you spending your anniversary on alert. I wanted you to be able to eat your dinner and talk to Ruth and laugh at Philip's toast. She looked at me for a long time. You infuriating man, she said quietly. I know. She put her hand on my arm. Her left hand, the weaker one, the one that had taken 14 months to come mostly back. The grip was firm. We walked out through the doors of Harrington's together. The November air in Boston was sharp and clean, and tasted like the beginning of something. Not the beginning of a problem or the beginning of a confrontation. The beginning of the part that comes after, the part where the structure that was always sound finally has room to breathe. I had parked my own car, the reliable one, the one Eleanor called boring, the one I drove because it was built well and started every morning, and had never once let us down in 11 years. I opened her door. She got in. I walked around to the driver's side. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. The city was quiet, the way cities are quiet, late on a Saturday, when most of the world has gone indoors. I told Douglas to put the beach house back in your name only, I said. Whatever happens with Michael and Vanessa going forward, that's yours, regardless of anything. Eleanor turned her head toward the window. She was quiet for a moment. I don't care about the beach house, she said. I know. That's why you should have it. A small sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh. Something between relief and exhaustion, the sound of a person setting down something they have been carrying for a long time without realizing how heavy it had gotten. Where do you want to go? I asked. She thought about it. Home, she said. I want to go home and sit in the kitchen and have a cup of tea, and not have to be graceful about anything for the rest of the night. I started the engine. That sounds like an excellent plan. We drove through the city, through the familiar streets I had driven for 31 years, past the elementary school where Michael had scraped his knees, and the diner where Eleanor and I had eaten breakfast every Sunday morning until it closed, past the park where we had walked every evening this summer after her stroke, slowly, her hand in mine, relearning the distance between point A and point B. Arthur, she said, as I turned onto our street. Yes, thank you. I did not say it was nothing. It was not nothing. It was 40 years of knowing that the most important structure I had ever been trusted to maintain was not made of steel or concrete or rebar. It was made of this. Mornings and suppers and cups of tea, and the specific warmth of a hand that knows the shape of yours. 40 years, I said. 40 years, she agreed. I pulled into the driveway. The kitchen light was on. Eleanor had left it on before we left, the way she always does. So the house looks alive when we come home. I got out of the car. I walked around to her side. I opened the door, and I offered her my hand, which she took, and we walked inside. What I know after 40 years is this. You cannot build anything that lasts on a foundation you have not inspected. You cannot trust the structure other people hand you simply because it looks finished from the outside. The cracks are always internal, and they are always deliberate, and they will always, under sufficient load, find the path of least resistance. But the reverse is equally true. A foundation that was built right, that was poured with care and cured properly and tested honestly over time, does not fail. Not in the cold, not in the flood, not under the weight of other people's greed or cruelty or the particular desperation of people who mistake inheritance for love. You do not protect something like that by luck. You protect it by showing up early. You protect it by checking the chairs.